So we got a ton of calls from our clients about these issues. Employers are concerned, employees and customers are concerned with these issues, and people traveling to Africa, parts of West Africa, or people that have been exposed potentially to the folks in the United States that have contracted the illness. So the things that employers are asking us, the big items are, A, should we quarantine employees? Should we send them home for 21 days? B, should we be making them take their temperature? Should we be taking their temperature? How do we deal with these issues, and how do we reassure our other employees and customers? So those are probably the top three issues I've been asked about. Number one, with the quarantine, just recently the CDC updated its guidance on quarantines, and we've seen in the news this past week, 3 states, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois, have done mandatory quarantine for people returning from West Africa that have been on Doctors Without Borders and mission trips, things like that. State of South Carolina has not done that. State of South Carolina is adopting the federal CDC guidance, which does not require a mandatory quarantine, and it's always case specific. So employers really need to keep up with what is the CDC recommending and what is the State of South Carolina Public Health Department recommending, because if you don't follow what the federal government or the state government's telling you, then you run the risk of violating the Americans with Disabilities Act by sending people home for 21 days. So for now, depending on where the person's traveled to, if they've traveled to Kenya, Kenya's not in West Africa. It's not one of the countries that's been impacted by the Ebola virus at this point. And so there's low to no risk of infection, and sending someone home for 21 days may not be the best course of action. If you have an employee that went over on a mission trip and was treating people with Ebola, then you may have a better argument to send them home for 21 days. We also are advising employers, if they do decide to send somebody home for 21 days, that they consider paying them for that time, because that will lower the likelihood of a challenge to that practice by way of a lawsuit, and it would limit the amount of damages in the event there was a lawsuit. So the other issue, number 2, we talked about is taking people's temperatures, asking them questions about their travel. Definitely we recommend that if you have employees traveling at this point, you can ask them questions. You shouldn't ask certain employees questions. If you have employees that are of African descent, only asking them questions about their travel plans might look like it's discrimination based on national origin, race. So if you are going to ask questions, do it for everyone that travels. Ask them where they've traveled to, whether they've been potentially exposed. All those questions are fine. None of them violate the ADA. You can even ask them questions if they have traveled to places that have been potentially exposed. If they were in New York City and they were on the same train as the person in New York City, you can ask them questions whether they're experiencing flu-like symptoms. Where those medical inquiries become potentially violative of the ADA is if you ask them questions about their susceptibility to different illnesses. So if they have a weakened immune system, that's something you wouldn't want to ask them about, because that could potentially reveal a disability that they have. So you can ask them about symptoms, not about susceptibilities. And then taking their temperature, again, depending on what the state's doing. If the state of South Carolina is going to be regulating healthcare workers and people coming back from West African countries, and in certain circumstances requiring those people to take their temperature twice a day, taking someone's temperature is the EOC considers a medical examination under the ADA. So that's a potential issue if, depending again on the circumstances of where they've traveled, what their risk of exposure is. All of this is kind of a balancing of what's the risk of exposure versus how much are you protecting your employees, and what's the risk of being challenged under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So employers really got to take a fact-specific look at each of these items and think through the risks before making any decisions. And then the last item that I've had a lot of questions about is what do we do if employees refuse to come to work? Somebody comes back from West Africa, or somebody's been to New York City, or somebody's been to Dallas, and other employees say, I'm not going to come to work while that person's there. Employers have to be very careful before they take adverse action or suspend somebody or discharge somebody for that decision, because refusals to come to work can be protected under the OSHA Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, as a protected safety complaint, or if you fire somebody for making a protected work refusal, it can be retaliation under the OSHA Act. And if 2 or more of your employees come to you together and say, we're afraid to come to work, we don't want to be infected with Ebola, can be protected under the National Labor Relations Act as protected concerted activity. So again, before taking any action against those employees, it's important to consider those things. That's why we recommend at least equipping managers with some talking points. If you believe this is an issue that's going to come up with your employees, equip your managers with some talking points about what we know about Ebola, what the government's saying, and what the potential risks are to try to reassure employees so that you don't have this issue with employees leaving work. Well, as you can tell from what we just discussed, there's a lot of different federal laws, state laws, there's privacy laws, HIPAA, a variety of different laws that we didn't even have time to discuss that impact your decisions in this realm. So it's always a good idea before you make a decision on sending somebody home or firing workers who refuse to come to work to consult a lawyer quickly and talk with them. And it doesn't have to be a long phone call, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're trying to be as compliant as we can in measuring the risks.